Welcome to Green and Red, Scrappy Politics for Scrappy People, a regular podcast on radical, environmental and anti-capitalist politics, brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
Welcome to the silky smooth sounds of the Green and Red podcast. I'm your co-host, Scott Parkin, in Berkeley, California today. And as always, I'm joined by
Bob Bazanko. I'm in Ohio right now.
And today we are going to be talking about it'll be a fun subject that we'll be talking about today, and it'll be somewhat topical with some of the recent news. But just to do a little bit of an intro, Trump's public life has long been the target of comedians and satirists. He is notorious for having thin skin and often lashing out at them on Twitter and Truth Social. So we're going to be talking about Trump. We're going to be talking today with Professor Sophia McClennen, who is a professor at Penn State and author of numerous books, including Trump Was a Joke, How Satire Made Sense of a President Who Didn't. She's also a regular contributor to Salon.com. Professor McClennen, welcome to Green and Red Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Yep. Maybe just to kind of kick it off a little bit, Trump is, like I said, is notoriously been the butt of many jokes. And in your book, you actually, one of the incidents that you talk about, which seems to be sort of maybe a pivotal moment in Trump's history in running for president, and just the satire and comedians kind of going after him, is the White House Correspondents' Dinner in 2011. There's even some speculation that his inability to take a joke ferociously spurred him to decide to run for president. But then we also, a theme of your book is how satire is a way to undermine Trump and Trumpism and things like that. Wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that incident, and then and then also your thoughts on how that undermined Trump and then also sort of empowered him in the same vein.
So yeah, for your listeners who aren't as familiar with it, the White House Correspondents Association Dinner has been an annual event that the purpose of which is to celebrate the First Amendment and to celebrate the ways in which the U.S. has a free press. So typically you have the president do a comedic monologue, usually somewhat self-deprecating, and that's really cool, because when you think about one of the things that makes the United States great, our presidents can get up there and make fun of themselves, so that's neat. And then it would be followed by a professional comedian who would roast the president in some way. So in that year, the comedian, first we had Barack Obama in office, and the comedian was Seth Meyers. And both Barack Obama and Seth Meyers brought up Trump in their monologues. In fact, the Barack Obama slam on Trump was pretty harsh, but Seth Meyers went after him as well. And it seemed to those people seated at the table, because Trump was in the audience that day, that Trump was really uncomfortable and frustrated by the Seth Meyers comments. So we heard that, but then later, the story gets even more interesting, because you find out, for example, that Trump says he's willing to come on Seth Meyers' show, but only if he apologizes publicly for the comments he's made. It just becomes a story in a way about how Trump really cannot take a joke. And as you pointed out, the other piece of the story that's somewhat fascinating for me is this question of whether or not the roast itself was why Trump decided to run, as though I'm going to run, I'll show these guys. In the book, I sort of point out that can't really be the case based on the longer history of Trump jokes, and also the longer history of the times that Trump talked about running for office. But it's certainly a great story to start the book with.
So, and why is satire you argue that satire is the best strategy to take on Trump, and there's this sort of, particularly during his presidency, he's the butt of jokes on late night. We see Alec Baldwin, do brilliant impressions of Trump on Saturday Night Live, both during the 2016 election and through his presidency. how is political satire the best strategy in order to take on Trump? And this is also, I'm asking this as a person who has spent a lot of time in the streets, taking on Trump myself. So I was at the inauguration in 2017, for example, blocking people out of it and things like that.
So let's just start with the fact that satire is a very unique form of political communication, and in general offers sort of nuggets, benefit that you don't get with straight communication, literal communication. So in general, satire offers benefits because it requires the audience to think critically. It requires the audience to think with nuance, and it tends to make its political statements bundled with the pleasure of comedy. So people remember it better. They don't fall into the anxieties sometimes you have as a political activist, et cetera. So those are things that we see with satire in general. Also, satire helps build communities. It kind of creates the sense of who's in on the joke, and that's super important for political action. The other thing that it does is it seems that, for example, people like to share satire, right? You don't want to consume it alone. So again, if you're trying to get a political message out, it's going to happen in a more effective way if it's wrapped around satire. So that's just true in general. But then you add Trump into the mix, and that's a big add. And that's really what this book is about, is that Trump was the most confusing, perplexing president the US has ever encountered, because he was so absurd, and absurd in the best, funniest, most ridiculous. Look at his crazy hair, look at his inability to speak English, etc., but also absurd in the most frightening ways. The sense that he was highly diabolical, that he was dismantling US institutions. So he was both incredibly silly and ridiculous, but also very dangerous. That's a very hard thing for straight media to cover, because it doesn't know whether to say, oh, look, Trump's doing something stupid again, or to say, oh my gosh, look what Trump's doing. So it kind of gets caught up in itself. And you saw the mainstream media also just become almost as obsessed with Trump as Trump supporters, right? It wouldn't stop covering every single tweet, every single thing he did, empty podiums, etc. The satirists, meanwhile, dove right in. They dove right in, especially into things like Trump's weird logic. So you had John Oliver doing bits on the whataboutism of Trump, where Trump would never get pinned down and take responsibility for anything, or the kinds of arguments that you would hear from the Trump team, especially things like the alternative facts argument that we got from Kellyanne Conway. So you heard the Trump criticism that comes from the satirists comes largely, of course, they make fun of how ridiculous he looks, but that's not satire. The real satire comes at the modes of thought, right? The arguments, the kind of foundational ideas behind Trumpism. It's kind of weird to even say foundational ideas, but the point was that the satirists were showing, right, the flaws in the arguments. And they were also showing the sort of hubris, bullying, bluster in a way that was just a lot more effective than what you tended to see in terms of how the mainstream media could cover it.
I always forget when I'm on mute. This is a little more kind of an abstract question, but I'm kind of more curious about, you pointed out that this is an effective way to get at Trump, and clearly he's thin-skinned, despite his claims of not being thin-skinned. But I grew up in a time where, I read Paul Krasner and listened to Moore and especially Art Buchwald, who I think really did get to Nixon. And I just wonder, if there's some way of gauging, does this reach people? One of the things I want to take up later, because I think it's, to me, the most important part of this, is that kind of these satirists or comedians jumped in because the media kind of bailed, really wasn't doing its job. But is there some way of gauging whether this did matter, or whether it was just kind of giving more ammunition to people whose minds were already made up, or giving Trump supporters more reason to hate the fake news or whatever?
Yeah, I love this question, because this is where it makes a difference to be a nerd like me and to actually do research as opposed to sort of speculate.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of people out there that write about satire. Malcolm Gladwell's in the mix, Steve Allman, for example, who have opinions about satire, but they don't do research, so they don't actually know what they're talking about.
I don't think Malcolm Gladwell does research on anything.
No,
Just like,
no,
he likes to talk.
That's a whole other podcast.
Yeah.
Okay, so, but let's go back to this. So this is the great question. First of all, at the end of the day, whether the satirist sort of pokes at the emperor, that's a fun question, but all it's going to do is sort of irritate the emperor. In fact, okay, so think of it this way. If the satirist gets to Trump and then Trump tweets, let's flow this through because we know this happened, right? Trump tweets some sort of whining, drama over Alec Baldwin's impression. It's not changing Trump because Trump is what he is. But what it is doing is it's allowing the public to see Trump act like a big baby. And that's interesting, right? It isn't going to affect a Trump supporter. It is going to embolden the Trump critic. So that's what happens on that side of it. But the more interesting thing, the part that we like to study is stuff like voting behaviors. Sort of you consume satire, what happens next? And what we find, and this is the really exciting stuff, we find that the satire consumer is simply a more active political citizen than the non-consumer satire consumer. And this is big news for the friends, the folks that I work with, because I work with activist groups like Indivisible, et cetera. What is it about this and why? And there's a lot of reasons, but one of the things is that I liked studying in this book is that people who consume satire tend to be highly cynical. So the data used to say, oh, if you're cynical, i.e. you are suspicious of the system, that's going to be bad because you're not going to want to vote. All you're going to want to do is sit on the couch and yell at your TV or something like that. If you're younger, yell at your phone. And this isn't going to help us, right? This isn't going to help us move the needle politically. That's the gut feeling. Well, the research shows that one of the things about satire is that it takes cynicism, but bundles anger. And even more importantly, bundles confidence. So the satire consumer is cynical because there's just a basic lack of trust, and it's well-founded is the issue, right? And there's anger that, the system isn't working to the benefit of the citizens. But most importantly, the satire consumer feels confident that they get the issues, that they get what's wrong and they get what needs to be done. And because of that, they donate more money, they vote at a higher rate, they hit the streets, they sign petitions, they call all of the metrics, whatever the metrics are that you like to think of as, this is how I know whether somebody's being politically active. All of those metrics, they score higher on all of them. Now, what's interesting, of course, is you could be a satire consumer and also watch NPR, et cetera, et cetera. But there's ways to sort of, it's simple enough. You're doing a questionnaire and you just check all the boxes. What are the things you're watching? So we can get pretty clear insights into political behavior and media consumption. And the bottom line is satire hits all the marks.
Do you know can you tell if people who are consumers of satire or comedy tend to trend more liberal or conservative or? I mean, it's one thing that strikes me as I read this is this is not lowbrow culture, right? It's up there a bit. And so it implies, I think, some level of awareness or even education, which is kind of what Trump would attack as the elitist, right? The coastal elites or whatever. So. This
has become increasingly the way we see the breakdown between what you might think of left brain media consumers, left politics brain, right politics brain. There's some good studies on this. That's not the work that I specifically do, but probably one of the smartest books on this to come out recently is a book by Danigal Young called Irony and Outrage. And her book sort of argues that irony is the sort of language of the left and outrage is the language of the right. The trouble with that, though, is that there's plenty of outrage on the left. And we did see this during Black Lives Matter. And then again, I'm not trying to be critical because sometimes outrage is just legitimate. So having a clear-cut breakdown isn't quite so simple. The other thing that we do know, and there's been more studies on this, which is that the consumer of satire is comfortable with not having things in black and white. Whereas it seems that we see today in contemporary GOP politics an electorate that's very uncomfortable with, oh, hey, Biden had classified documents. That was bad. Trump had classified documents, bragged about it, obfuscated the, that's worse. Like they don't seem to be good with that. And so because of that, they also don't like satire because satire is that kind of comedy. One of the things that I get into in my work is that there's a lot of folks have a really difficult time sussing out the distinction between the type of comedy that's just mocking and mean, sort of what we get with Greg Gutfeld on Fox News, and true satire, which is far more cerebral and nuanced, in part because someone like Stephen Colbert, in a given bit, will do those lowbrow jokes bundled with sophisticated satire. So they tend to move in and out of these kinds of modes. So not even the, sort of one of my favorites, George Carlin, is still gonna, mock someone for being, overweight or something, right? So those kinds of mean, how you look jokes can come out of even the most sophisticated satirists. But yes, you're right. In general, we're finding that it does seem to break down across party lines. That has not always been historically true. And it's a little sad in a way, because I think we all do better when we engage in satire that maybe criticizes, or it gets us to ask questions about the positions we've gotten comfortable with.
Definitely.
Yeah, I mean, just kind of thinking about that. I mean, I am going back to my younger years watching Dana Carvey as George Bush, and then Tina Fey as Sarah Palin, and then Alec Baldwin as Trump, and I also come from that generation where I grew up on Saturday Night Live and pre-internet and that sort of thing. And so there was always this assumption I had that like Dana Carvey helped actually undermine Bush in '92, and Tina Fey helped undermine Palin in 2008. And is it reasonable to assume, like, because it seemed like we were in a lot of saturation of Trump media. I think you call him the first media-centric president in your book. Were we too oversaturated with media, with television and internet and everything like that, to where it's going to have as much of an impact? Clearly he lost, but also there was like a lot of outrage and fear. 2020, like you were saying, there's a lot of outrage in 2020. So how much did satire contribute to Trump losing the election in that moment?
Yeah, I mean, those are questions that are not exactly, we can't really research that and give a special answer on that in a way. But we do know, for example, that with Tina Fey, it was quite easy in that case to show that those impersonations hurt the Palin image. And even more interesting, the study, one of the most well-known studies on that, showed that both independents and Republicans were suddenly like, ugh, when it came to thinking about voting for Palin. So it seems quite clear that those impersonations affected that ticket. Now, fast forward, it becomes a little difficult because we have a completely different sort of electorate landscape. So, we do have to remind ourselves that we had quite a bit of satire going in to 2016, and we still ended up with Trump. So it isn't as though it stopped it. The things I like to think about are how satire helped create a common vocabulary for people, particularly when they were dealing with the aftermath of the election and they were depressed and overwhelmed. Satire did a really good job of keeping people from sort of falling into, sort of a sense of being dejected and morose. It's not likely, right, given the landscape. And when you think about it, let's just say the Daily Show on a really good day, it's going to maybe reach 3 million people. It isn't that. So from that sense, on the moving the needle, that becomes, you can get reasonable data on how big is the satire audience. And the bottom line is it pales in comparison to the people who never vote, right? So making an argument that satire is why we don't have Trump as president today, I'm not comfortable saying that specifically. But what we can see is that satire has a lot to do with framing conversations around the images of people. The trouble with Trump, and the reason why he is such an unusual figure, is that he himself, markets NFT cards where he's, Superman. So it becomes very hard for a satirist to be the person making Trump look ridiculous when he already does it himself. So that, again, that's part of what has made Trump such an enigma for the satirist. And again, my argument is that ended up being a good thing.
That's when Kissinger won the Nobel Peace Prize, Paul Krasner said it was the end of satire. And I think kind of since then, we're kind of seeing that these guys go further and further over the top, in ways, Trump, especially in ways that had a comedian done that before Trump, it would have been unbelievable. And I think that's kind of really the problem here. It's just, what he does in real life is more absurd than anything you could really make up about him.
Well, what I like to tell people is imagine that the satirist just sort of has its go-to toolkit, and the hammer is exaggeration and the screwdriver is invective. And these are the things that the satirist uses. Andy Borowitz, who has a column with the New Yorker, came out after Trump was elected and said, okay, how do you make satire out of this? Because if I read these headlines, they already seem like a joke, even though they're actually real. And we did sort of start to see this after 9/11. This is part of my early research was on sort of the George W. Bush years. The thing is that because Trump took those go-to tools out of the toolkit, what you saw was that the satirists went in two split directions. On the one hand, they got crass. You had Samantha Bee using the C word. You had Stephen Colbert using the other C word. You had them just getting frustrated and being crass and not being particularly creative, just sort of jumping into being funny but angry in a way that I think was gratifying for their audiences, but again, wasn't sort of the most creative, artistic form of satire. On the other side of it, though, they did develop their art. They had to, or they couldn't, again, work. So one of the things that I talk about in the book is that under Trump, and this had been somewhat of a long time coming, and it had been being developed when Jon Stewart was on The Daily Show, satirists started to defend democracy. So it had, we go back to a time like George Carlin, or even better, the Smothers Brothers, right? The whole thing is, let's make fun of this system because it isn't serving us. And then if we make fun of the system, then, people will rethink it. But I'm not going to do the rethinking for you. I'm the comedian, rattling the shaking the tree. Under Trump, we saw from Jimmy Kimmel lecturing Trump on healthcare and gun reform, to Seth Meyers explaining to Trump what it meant to be presidential in the wake of the Charlottesville attacks, to Stephen Colbert, again, lecturing Samantha Bee, calling Ivanka, saying Ivanka should actually taking care of families seriously, etc. You saw these satirists come out in these really thoughtful, clear, missions, political policy mission that we had never seen. So in the book, I sort of joke that it's like we created a ministry of satire, where the satirists felt like it was their job to defend U.S. institutions, right? You had Hassan Minhaj talking about how the Trump cabinet didn't understand the jobs that they were, hired to do. So this was a completely new facet that we suddenly had the satirists not just upset about it, but really trying to coach their audiences into understanding the ways in which core pillars of our democracy were being whittled away and what we might be able to do about it. So that activist piece really got strong under Trump.
Trump, notoriously thin-skinned. We actually shared a video between the two of us. Bob sent it to me about Trump not being able to take a joke, and it's like him giving a speech in Columbia. I think it must have been the night of a correspondence dinner, and other presidents seem to take the jokes a lot better. They go and sit at the correspondence dinner, for example, and laugh and retort, respond and things like that. How much of this of Trump being undermined do you think was his inability to take a joke, and that there's this, like you were saying, there's a percentage of the country that didn't appreciate that, while there's another percentage of the country, another half, which got defensive about it?
Well, you kind of look at it as it's on the autocrat meter, right? The more autocratic a leader tends to be more difficult for that leader to handle any jokes about them. So Trump's right up there with Putin, with Xi Jinping, right? With Lukashenko. He can't handle a joke because he's an autocrat. And so at some level, we see that what's interesting about it is sort of the presidents who are more comfortable with the role they have, i.e., I am not in power because I have a massive ego. I'm in power because I'm part of a democratic system. And that means you guys can make fun of me if you want, because I'm here to serve you. And so they tend to have a different attitude about the jokes. Jimmy Carter was notorious for saying that after he left office, it was really nice because when people waved at him, they used all their fingers. That's a great example of a president who can take a joke and who understood that when he was in office, he was dealing with a lot of heavy criticism. Even Ronald Reagan was way better at taking jokes than Trump. So I think it's more of a measure of that sort of, not just thin skin, but also a sign that Trump simply cannot stand not to control everybody's opinion of him.
Yeah. Before we go on, I just want to tell people where you're listening or watching the Green and Red podcast with Scott and Bob, and please continue to support us and follow us and subscribe and all that. And today we're talking to Sophia McClennen, who is the author of Trump Was a Joke, with a foreword by Michael Moore, which is really cool too. And, great book, which, Trump was traumatic for a lot of people. And so I know Scott and I talk probably almost every day and we have for years. And so, kind of just making jokes about Trump was a mechanism to kind of avoid the absolute horrors of it all. And I just do you see that as kind of like being these satirists are almost like national therapists and kind of giving you some kind of like reason to take it down a few notches?
I would have to say that the sort of psychology of satire has probably been one of the more exciting facets of the work I'm doing. I'm not a psychologist, but I'm reading the research and I'm teaming up with folks in both neuroscience, cognitive science, psych, to sort of get at these questions better. Probably the most important thing we saw, in my view, wasn't just moving the needle in terms of redefining Trump or getting voters active, which of course is very important. It was the fact that during the Trump years, and it's even still true, we lived in a news media landscape where the market share for lies, misinformation, bullying, and gaslighting was so high. And what we know happens to the brain is that it just basically gets worn out. So if I lie to you again and again, I say, Trump was elected in 2020. Trump was elected in 2020. You're like, no, he wasn't. No, wait, what? And then eventually it becomes hard on the brain when you're processing a lie again and again. What's fascinating to me is that satire also communicates via lies, in the sense that the use of irony in satire is, in fact, an inversion of the literal meaning. So, for example, Colbert used to have guests on his show and he'd say, George W. Bush, great president or greatest president? It was a perfect example a way to show, one, how George W. Bush couldn't handle any criticism, et cetera, but he never meant either, right? But I could say to you, George W. Bush, great president, greatest president, you would smile, you would take pleasure in it, you feel clever when you get the joke, you feel sort of it like, again, this is the great thing, there's an emotional like thrill, even though we're still talking about a really bad president. Under Trump, it's the same thing. The satire worked cognitively to help us not fall into a pit of depression, and even more importantly, helped our minds not sort of get sucked into the misinformation landscape. So, neuroscientists are looking a lot now at what do you do? Like, how do you keep people from, say, thinking that Hillary Clinton is actually running a child trafficking ring out of the basement of a pizza parlor? How do you do that? And what they find is that, first of all, you keep the mind good at logic. You keep the mind good at navigating the information landscape. And you keep the mind good at noticing when a narrative is just ridiculous. And how do you do that? Again, they're looking at all these different strategies. Well, I say that's what satire does all the time. That's what it's doing. It's teaching you better logic. It's teaching you to say, hey, I'm being given a choice between two things and they're a false choice, etc. Right? It gets you to question the way in which you're getting information, and it gets you to question the information itself. So it's a perfect foil for that kind of, sort of negative downer Trump media space.
Just to switch topic a little bit, I'm kind of curious. A lot of who we've been talking about are like the late night comedians and stand-up comedians and stuff. But I'm interested in Michael Moore, because Bob mentioned is does the foreword of your book, and he plays a somewhat unique role. He's he definitely comes out of comedy and has played he does satire, but he also does a lot of there's a lot of like real commentary that he puts out there. I mean, Fahrenheit 9/11 I always consider to be like an editorial on the Bush years, and I'm kind of curious what your thoughts are on that sort of bridge between serious journalism and comedy. And Michael Moore, for example, how does what role does he play in this media landscape? Just your thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, I really think Michael Moore is one of the great satirists in U.S. history, and I think people will see that a lot more later, because that's sort of how those things work. But one of the things that he did, if you look back, I mean, the show, The Awful Truth that he had, and then it was TV Nation, or maybe it was TV Nation and The Awful Truth, I forget which, but that really was a precursor to what we had on The Daily Show. So Michael Moore's instincts earlier on, because you're right, he didn't come out of a comedy training as much as he came out of just a journalist, activist background. He knew that one of the ways to get people to pay attention to an issue was to package it in irony. So if you want to, so Roger and me, right? You want to show that a CEO is inaccessible to the people. You just go and you do this kind of goofy, like, hey, I just want to say hi, and so he's very clever at creating these stunts. He, when he did the which film was it? I think it was Fahrenheit 11/9, or the new one.
The Trump one.
He goes to Rick Snyder's house in Michigan with a water truck and starts pumping water on the governor's mansion, and says, I brought you water from Flint. It's just funny. And so when you do these kinds of stunts, again, you reveal the limits. And so the reason why it's super effective is we get very used to the sort of political rhetoric where the governor comes out and says, we're doing everything we can, and we obviously take your best interest, blah, blah, blah. Michael Moore is a totally brilliant mind when it comes to figuring out how to poke at that and expose the fact that, say, the governor is not looking out for the people. He's looking out for corporate interests in this case, or whatever it is that he's deciding to attack. So when he wrote, I love the letter he wrote to the, Ivanka saying, please, we need you to stage an intervention with your father. This was in the lead up to the 2016 election. It was great because at the time everyone was like, well, isn't Ivanka the reasonable one? And isn't she this? And isn't she that? And he just exposes it for all its absurdity. And so he's been, really fantastic at that. So I think he just has that trickster, playful, it comes naturally to him. But as you pointed out, for him, the dominant thing is let's change the world, right? Let's just change the world. So you could put him in one side of this and then put somebody like Jimmy Kimmel on another side where, look, Jimmy Kimmel, sure, he does have passions now that actually Trump activated. But at the end of the day, Jimmy Kimmel really wants to make sure he keeps his show. So, in the lineup of how politically engaged and politically committed these satirists are, they're going to vary. And I think that's great. I think that's just good for the public. It's good for satire. It's some days I want to dive into Michael Moore's latest thing, and other days I want to watch something silly on The Daily Show. You get everything.
Yeah, I always thought of Moore also as a muckraker more than, I think Jon Stewart is kind of taking that role on a bit because they're dealing with like specific issues. But I think a lot of these folks, Moore, I think does stand out. And actually, it reminds me of something I saw in an interview. I actually listened to his podcast a couple of years ago. And he said in 2016, he went to the Hillary Clinton campaign, and he offered, along with Al Franken and I think Jeanine Garofalo, to write jokes to use in the debate. Or to use at the Al Smith dinner, or maybe both. And because they knew Trump was thin-skinned and this was a way to get to him. And Clinton sent him away saying, no, she didn't want to do that. And which I think speaks to all kinds of different issues. But I just kind of curious if that kind of corresponds to the kind of stuff your research is showing you.
Well, yeah, the Clinton, that's a whole, again, that's a whole other
That's another
thing.
podcast too, right?
Yeah, unfortunately. No one asked us, right? Well, they did, or even Michael Moore was giving good advice, but they didn't take it. So the question is more. I think I lost what.
Well, I think the way you're describing this, satire tends to appeal to a certain group of people who, I think the conservatives would say they're a bunch of liberal elites. Let's just throw that out there for the hell of it. And yet. Although these satirists are acting independently, they don't have kind of this institutional support, like from the Democratic Party, let's say, who kind of tend to stay away from. I'm thinking of like Michelle Wolf, who I love. I think she's awesome in 2018, who was just like eviscerated by everybody after her at the Correspondents' Dinner, after her gig at the Correspondents' Dinner. So it's just like, I guess the point is like, is there this kind of institutional rejection of that, even though these people are actually working on the same thing?
Well, I would say, okay, so really at some level, what I'm seeing as a scholar of political satire is that the news media they tend to start with something like, wow, the political satire is really great. It's really helpful. And then, oh my goodness, oh, it's too much. Oh, that was too much. Oh, you went over the line, you crossed the line, you insulted Sarah Huckabee Sanders or whatever. So actually what I think, if you zoom out and you watch sort of the mainstream news response to political satire in general, to what work it's doing in advancing political conversations, what you sort of see is just this roller coaster, because what the news media tends to do is it loves something, then it worries over it, then it loves it, then it worries over it, then it loves it. Because that becomes the story. It becomes very scripted. And so when Michelle Wolf got slammed, which I thought was funny, and I bet she did too, it was so stupid. It was it was like one of those moments when the news media just looks ridiculous. You have Micah Brzezinski and up in the Twitter, and everyone is like, oh my goodness, that was too much. And I thought it really wasn't that much. And so you guys all had these sort of ready to go. That's what I think. The cynic in me thinks these folks kind of prepare their reactions in a way. They know a little bit and they're ready. They want to say, oh, we're not that country. We don't make fun of people that way. That's not right. I'm like, oh, really? We're not that country? Talk to Ben Franklin, because, we are in fact that country. That's one of the things we're very good at.
They said, I mean, in the early republic, Jefferson, Adams, all those guys were accusing each other of being pedophiles and having bastard children, and they're just way over the edge, more than even Trump. So yeah, I think that's the part that always kind of, and this is like the bigger question, which isn't really the theme of your book, but I was saying this for 4 years, is like the resistance is coming from, Michael Moore, Stephen Colbert, John Stewart, which is great, right? But should that really be where our political resistance is focused, on comedians on late night TV? Every day the New York Times puts out a list of the previous night shows and the highlights of it. And I also kind of got the sense from people I talked to who, that was their level of activism. They were listening to this, they were telling people this, they were sharing these videos, they weren't doing anything else. And I just wondered if that could be kind of an issue where the regular media is just kind of fallen flat. And so we're relying on these people for resistance.
Well, this is this is like the bazillion-dollar question.
Yeah, of course.
At the heart of it. So the question is, so the things that we hear, satire could be a distraction. Satire could make you feel complacent, like you just laughed, so you did everything you needed to do. Satire could be sort of more of a analgesic, in a way, actually deterring action. Those worries, it makes sense for you to worry about that. But I can tell you, they're unfounded. So for example, what you would have to do, and there's no study that really would, I have to think if there's been a study to try to track this, where you would have gone to the march, but you didn't go because you watched The Daily Show or something, right? People who are politically active in particular ways are politically active in particular ways, whether they watch The Daily Show or not. There's simply no data that suggests that the person who would have otherwise been politically active was disincentivized because they laughed at a satirical joke. What I'm showing and what I'm explaining is that it's the other way. Satire, the other thing is, we have to understand that in any political landscape, a substantial portion of the population does just sit on their butts. That's what they do. That's the math of it. So you're going to have a certain amount of people that they get in the street, a certain amount of people who will share things, donate money, sign petitions, but they're not getting in the street, right? So we can put people into different kinds of buckets of the types of political activities they do. What we see with satire consumers is that they tend to be higher in the activities that we consider to be political than non-satire consumers. And so the idea that satire is a distraction, a deflection, takes someone who would otherwise act and gets them not to act, that just doesn't, it's not true. So the other question, which is, I think, perhaps the more important one, is how do you get people to mobilize in a political landscape where mobilization is so critical? Because now we have elected this guy, Donald Trump, and this is extremely bad. And that's where we get back to Michael Moore, because he talked about forming an army of comedy. We did see activism, particularly local activism, where folks were suddenly like, you know what, I'm going to run for school board. You know what, I'm going to run for city council. And I can tell you, in my own, state college, I now have, 3 or 4 friends who are more than that, who've run for local office. That was a Trump consequence. So that's actually a good thing. And if you look at Indivisible, which is a local grassroots organizing network, they are a perfect example of how they use sort of satirical stunts to help get people involved. So for example, let's say we're living in a town and we want to get our representative to meet with us. Well, what are the chances? Representative says, no, they're busy. So in Indivisible, they were doing things like having these town halls with their representative who was missing by putting an empty suit there. Or in one case that I really love, they put a chicken on the podium and, pretended they were having this town hall, called the media. Then the media shows up and covers the missing representative, and the joke is, you're supposed to be representing us, but you won't meet with us. So they draw attention to the irony of that. So at the heart of the book, right, I said, when the situation is ironic, i.e., the least qualified person wins a job that requires the most qualifications, or your representative doesn't represent you, things like that, creative satire uses creative irony to expose that in a way that's highly effective. Indivisible ran billboards in South Florida that was like, have you seen Marco Rubio? We're worried about him. Things like that. So they could come out and they could be angry and could say, where's Marco Rubio? This guy, he's not showing up. Or they could do these billboards. Which one's better, right? So the one makes the same point, but it does it with irony and mirth, and people love it, and they will remember it, and it will motivate them at a higher. So you get the group of people who tend to tune out political activist, sort of the traditional type of political action, where they're like, oh, I don't want to deal with that. But because it's funny, they pay attention. So that's the other part of the research. We find that comedy and satire in particular draw in a bigger audience who would otherwise not, they would just be like, oh, I'm not going to listen to another political podcast. Like, I can't do that. But if there's some humor in it, they can do it. And that's why, certain podcasts that have some humor in them, for example, can widen that base.
I think that's why every organizer should be familiar with Abby Hoffman in detail, because I have we're getting close to the end, and I know Scott has a couple of wrap-ups. I have a couple of questions which really aren't specifically about the book, but I'm just curious because you're the expert on this. First is Al Franken, who I thought politically was actually quite good too, and funny guy, and used all these tools that you're talking about, but his own party got rid of him for, in my view, essentially participating in his craft, maybe not in the most pleasant way, but I just kind of wonder what you think that means, that you have a guy whose own people get rid of him, dismiss him because of what he does.
Yeah, I mean, the Al Franken story is a rough one. I was sorry to see him leave office. I think it's more in this particular case the timing. I think at the time, the Me Too movement was just getting steam, and there were going to be casualties where it wasn't possible to be nuanced. It wasn't possible to say there's a difference between Harvey Weinstein and Al Franken. At that time, people weren't in the mood for that. That's unfortunate. I think it's a little better now. So that's what I would say about that. I really think it was a timing thing. I don't think it's going to be the same. It depends on the, again, the rhythms of cancel culture and what that can do. It's a pretty terrifying beast when it comes after you. And people tend to not be nuanced, whether they're on the left or the right, as we've seen in the Franken case. So that's sort of a unique story, I think. But I do think you're right. I mean, I think it was a loss, and he was really, a good voice in the Senate.
There's so much more about it. One last thing. Are you familiar with Trey Crowder and Brett Terhune? No. They're Southerners, and their persona is like liberal rednecks. Essentially, they come on and they play it over the top that they're from Tennessee or they're from the South. And then it's just this scathing attack on the MAGA crowd. And it's like, I like it because, it's people who are in that culture, who aren't like from the out, like they're not like, Bay Area liberals or Manhattan liberals making fun of these people. They're from that culture. And I just wondered if that's the kind of thing that actually might be able to reach some of these folks who normally you would think are unreachable.
Yeah, well, there's two pieces to that. One is, yes, that kind of comedy is extremely funny and extremely effective because almost all comedy is boundary heightening. So what does that mean? There's very little comedy that hits all human beings in the same way. I like to call it the everyone poos comedy. Basically, like you can make jokes about the human body, like, oh, my body does weird stuff, and then we all laugh. But generally, all comedy requires some sort of boundary, right? So there's the it getters, and then there's the butt of the joke. So if the people making the jokes are already sort of sensed as inside the group, you can get farther. There are types of jokes that they can make, and they won't seem mean. So that's great. And so now I'm curious about these guys. So that's just true. Now, the other part of this, the question of will this potentially move the needle on a MAGA supporter? I hate to tell you guys this, forget them. The MAGA supporters are not changing their minds. There's nothing you're saying, literally nothing. In fact, the research suggests the opposite. If you try to change their minds, they're more likely to hold on to their beliefs even more fervently. So forget them. Work on the big, messy middle. In the United States, about 1/3 of the potential electorate doesn't step up. That's your audience. Those are the people. The committed folks that are voted for Trump twice now, forget them. You got to forget about them. And what's fascinating is only the left that even thinks about this problem as though that's their thing that they want to do. They want to, and I was like, that is really one of the deepest flaws to the left way of thinking, that we have to get everyone to agree with us. You know what? Forget them, because it's not going to work. Meanwhile, you continue to communicate to the people who you know are politically active, and then you try to draw and expand that boundary. And most importantly, appeal to the young voters, which is again why the comedy is so effective, because they love that.
Well, I think, I always tell people in an election, you're not convincing 50%, you're convincing 2 or 3%. If you can flip a few million people, you're set. I mean, Biden actually won handily in 2020. It wasn't really that close. So, and that's the fun, like when you talk about stealing elections, if you're going to steal an election, you can't steal 20,000 votes. You can steal a couple hundred, like in Florida in 2000, but you're not going to steal Arizona or Georgia. So, I'll send you a link. But Brett Terhune is funny. He has this over the top big beard personality, and he'll act like this like incredibly crazed bigot, talking about Target or Pride Month or Cracker Barrel, and it's just hilarious because he just within 3 minutes, just exposes all the idiocy of it all, and within that. Of course, a lot of people think I'm serious too. If you look at his the comments, there are people who think that's who he really is.
Right. So he's doing it in character stuff.
Yeah, he's doing it in character. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's what Stephen Colbert did.
Yeah.
It's Colbert Nation kind of stuff.
Yeah. Remember,
I love that.
people would come on there and they didn't realize that was an act. It was like, wow.
Well, and character satire is some of the hardest to pull off, but it's also the most powerful when it works.
Yeah. Well, I could talk to you for another hour, but I know Scott has a couple of follow-ups. So
my last question is just because it's topical. Trump was indicted last week, and
was he?
may have heard a little something about that, and I'm wondering, we're in this sort of like post-Trump presidency, moment too, which is, and so maybe the bigger question is, I in your book you actually talk about how something like 40% of media hits were included Trump, and 65% of them actually had Trump speaking. And so how has he's out of office now, yet he still seems to be in the media spotlight, but he's been indicted twice this year already in 2023, and I'm kind of curious, has been in a post-presidency moment for him, and then these two indictments and lots of other things are coming out. There's supposedly going to be a third indictment by the end of the summer. Has that shifted at all? I know that there's 40% of the country that it's like ride or die, but I'm wondering if there's been a shift since he's been out of office around satire, around comedy, around sort of picking at him the way he was when he was president.
Oh, yeah. So you're asking, has the satire changed? Because I wasn't sure if you were asking about the news media. The news media has been a mess, because at first they said, we're not going to cover him so much.
Yeah.
And then they said, oh, oops, yes, we
Yeah.
are.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
we're
sorry, I
going to do
wasn't
it
clear.
and complain about ourselves doing it. So I don't think I've seen anything really substantial in terms of a change. At the end of the day, what we're seeing in the satirical coverage of Trump is just that whole, whoa, 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 don't let this guy set the narrative. That's been the dominant problem with covering Trump, is that Trump, for example, gets indicted and then says, oh my goodness, I'm a victim. Look at this biased judicial system. And I didn't do anything wrong. And I'm going to eat a steak and play Pavarotti or whatever, so also look at me, I'm great. So those are the things he's doing. And then the news media tended to react to it. The satirists tended to just not let Trump control the story and the elements of the story and the ways they would dive into it. So once they get that bit, once they're doing that, there's not a whole lot of new sort of tricks up their sleeve. So I haven't, I don't think I've seen any big shifts yet.
Maybe it'll shift when he gets the nomination from jail. I'm sure that will.
We thought we would get perp walk satire, but we didn't get that. But
No. So I'm still holding out for that. Folks, we've been talking with Professor Sophia McClennen, author of Trump Was a Joke, How Satire Made Sense of a President Who Didn't. We'll have links in the show notes about places where you can get the book and lots of her other work. You can check her out on Salon, which looks to be monthly, I believe, is the columns-ish, monthly-ish. Thanks for joining us. And folks who like this show, check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you're watching on YouTube, hit subscribe. If you're listening to us on one of the many audio platforms we're on, hit subscribe there and give us a rate and review. Helps us with the algorithms. And if you want to make a donation, go to greenandredpodcast.org and hit that support button or become a patron at patreon.com/greenredpodcast. And until then, everyone, go out and make trouble and misbehave, do a little street theater, make some comedy, whatever it is that you need to do to mix things up a little bit. We'll talk to you all again really soon.